let's assume to be a person, you need to have a certain level of psychological complexity. For example, you have to be conscious, you have to have memory or be capable of memory, and perhaps some other psychological traits like being able to form intentions or something like that. If having these psychological traits are required to be a metaphysical person, the human fetus, at least early in its development, is not a person. Now, if all of this is true, then the person we are today is not numerically identical with the fetus. That is, we never were a fetus. Instead, what appears to be the case is that at some point in the development of the human organism, a person emerges. And this emerges when the human body is complex enough to allow for a complex psychology. Given this account, Eric Olson asks the following question. When the person appears, what happens to that human fetus? What happens to that organic life form? He believes that if we take personhood to be tied to having certain psychological traits, then the individual who has this account of when persons emerge and how they continue to survive, there's only two options. The first is with respect to what happened to the fetus. When the person first appears, the fetus, I guess the human organism, dies. And then the second option is that the fetus survives as a more developed human organism, so it just continues to grow, and it occupies the same space, time, and material as the human person. In other words, you have two things occupying the same space, time, and having the same material as their parts. Now, Olson rejects both of these accounts. So the original account that I gave you in terms of a person emerging at some point in which it has complex psychological development, he thinks this is not the right answer to understanding what it means to be a person and how we continue as persons. So let's consider both of these options. So the first option, if you remember, is when the first person first appears, the fetus or the organism dies. And so it just kind of continues to fail to develop into a baby or a child or human development. As Olson puts it, the fetus necessarily ceases to exist as soon as its nervous system has developed enough to make thought possible. Each human fetus or infant must perish in the act of bringing forth a human being. Now, Olson characterizes this first option as completely absurd. He says it would be one of the most remarkable and one of the saddest facts in all of natural history. I think he thinks it's remarkable since it would make human beings just these kind of exceptional creatures. Since while every other non-human fetus or embryo would survive into adulthood, the organic life form would continue on. The human organism, by exception, would perish once it obtains a certain level of psychological complexity. In addition to its exceptional nature, Olson points out that the human organism dying when a person appears is kind of a strange thing. And it's strange because it would be a case where something dies when it kind of gains a power. That is, all the powers associated with it having a psychology. So it's strange because as soon as the human fetus gains the power to be conscious, to think, to remember, that's what causes it to no longer exist. Generally, we think that an organism or thing might perish or not continue to survive if it loses a power rather than gains a power. Okay, so this leaves us to the other option. And this is the option I think that people tend to lean towards. It's just more natural. On this option, the fetus survives and develops into an adult human, and the person emerges when the fetus reaches a certain level of psychological complexity. On the second option, there are a few things worth pointing out. The first is that the person is actually composed of organic material. The person has a human body. The second is that while this body is the same body as the fetus, that is, there's biological continuity between the fetus and the adult human, the person never was a fetus because the person has this psychological complexity. In order to be a person, you have to have those certain psychological traits, and the fetus never had those things. The third is that the human body, which developed from the fetus, and the person, they occupy the same space and time and have the same parts. And then finally, even though the human body and the person occupy the same space and time, they are two different things. So one of the points to be clear about is that there are two objects, the human organism and the person, and they are different things occupying the same space and time. Now, this point is sometimes hard to grasp, so let me just kind of point out why the human organism and the person are different things. The first thing that we can point out is that the organism, the human being, is older than the person because the human organism, at least at one time, was a fetus, in contrast to the person who never was a fetus. The second is that the organism can survive in certain scenarios where the person does not. For example, the person, if they lost their capacity for consciousness or capacity for memory, they would no longer be a person. But the human organism could continue to live. It's just as an unconscious human organism. And then the third is, this is more speculative, but perhaps the person could survive in scenarios where the organism does not. So just as a kind of hypothesis, maybe your psychology could be supported by a new body because your old body is dying, or maybe it could be supported artificially. So this would be a case where the person, the psychology, the consciousness, the memory survives, but the body in which it occupies, it perishes or no longer exists. So with these key points in mind, I think the main thing to kind of focus in is a couple of points is, the first, there exists a human being that is numerically identical to the fetus. So the key thing to remember is that the human being once was a fetus. The second is there exists a person that never was a fetus because the person has to have certain psychological complexity, certain psychological powers, and the fetus never had those. And then the third is that the human being and the person are distinct things, but they occupy the same space and time. So Olson finds this second option problematic. He thinks it, in addition to the first option not working, he thinks the second option also doesn't work. So I think the interesting part of his argument is why he thinks that the second option doesn't work. So let's look at this. First, he claims that this second option entails the odd conclusion, we are not human animals. So even though we look like organisms, we look like human animals, we're alive, we occupy the same space and time as human organisms, are composed of the same kind of parts of as a human organism, are arranged in just the same way that human organisms are arranged. At the same time, we are not animals. We're something that is kind of housed in animals, but we're distinct from being just a human being. The second thing that he points out is he also takes this second option to be mistaken because it entails that it is, and I'll quote, uncertain whether you and I are people at all. So I think this is the more interesting line. And so I will kind of call this the epistemic argument. So here is what I take to be the epistemic argument. I'll give you the statement of it, and I'll give you a kind of shortened version of it to kind of remember. So the first premise of this argument is that the human being and the person occupy the same space and time, are composed of the same parts, are composed of the same material, have the same behaviors, and importantly, have the same brain states. The second premise is that since the human being and the person are composed of the same material, arranged in the same way, have the same behaviors, same brain states, etc., the human being and the person have the same thoughts. So I think this is a kind of a key premise here, that the human being, the adult animal, and the human person, they have the same thoughts. So the third premise is that you think you are a unique kind of thing, and this type of thing is known as a metaphysical person. So there's something about you that is different from, rocks and tables and trees, and even maybe unconscious animals. Premise 4 is, if you think you are a person, then the human being thinks it is also a person. So remember that a human animal and the person both have the same thoughts. So if you think you're a person, so does the human animal. Premise 5 is that on the psychological theory of personal identity, this is the account that I gave at the beginning, the person and the human animal are distinct, And so only one of you can be correct. You both can't be persons. There are two beings occupying the same space and time and have the same parts and same thoughts. But only one of those individuals can be persons because the person is distinct from the human animal. Premise 6 is that there's no evidence that would decide who is correct here. There's no way to look at the thoughts that are being had, which is the belief that I am a person, and decide, is it I, the organism that's thinking it is a person, or is it I, the person, thinking that it's a person? Premise 7 is a theory of personal identity that tries to give an account of who we are and our persistence through time should not entail the consequence that we just don't know whether or not we are persons. And so our conclusion is, therefore, we should reject this account that I gave you at the beginning of this video that understands who we are and our persistent conditions in terms of our psychology. Okay, so that's a long-winded reconstruction of the argument. So let me give you a shorter version of it. And this comes from Eric Parfit. He says, if there are two conscious beings thinking all my thoughts, the person and the animal, how could I know which one I am? If I think I am the person, animalists object, I might be mistaken, since I may really be the animal. Now with that statement, let me give you a kind of quick overview of the whole thing. If we accept some kind of psychological theory of diachronic personal identity, what does it mean to be the same person over time? Then we have to answer the puzzling question of whether I ever was a fetus. The psychological theory, the theory that accounts for who we are and how we persist through time in terms of some aspects of our psychology, seems committed to answering that no person was ever a fetus, given that the fetus lacks sufficient psychological complexity. That is, the fetus is not conscious, doesn't have memory, and so forth. But at some point, the human organism develops to have a sufficiently complex psychology such that we can say a person is present. Once it is on the scene, that is, once the person is on the scene, we have the question of what happens to the human fetus. On the one hand, it seems just completely absurd to say, well, the human being, or the human fetus in this case, dies. On the other hand, if it carries on in the form of a more developed human organism, then we have this like weird puzzling situation where the human organism and the person, which are distinct things, occupy the same space and time, are composed of the same material, have the same thoughts, commit the same actions, and so forth. Since they both think that they are persons, it's just unclear whether we, who think ourselves to be persons, are really persons. We could simply be the animal thinking that it is a person. So there are a number of responses to this particular argument, but I'm just generally interested if you have any thoughts. Do you think the argument is good? Do you think that there's a problem with it? And if so, which one of the premises you think is the problematic one? And how would you go about rejecting Olson's account if you actually think it's problematic?